welcome everyone to another episode of Gaming Mechanics, a podcast where we seek to explore the unexplored topics of games, how they work, why they work, and why we love them. My name is Greg. With me, as always, is my co-host Mark.
Hello, everyone.
And today we're back. We were out last week, and by we I mean I. I think Mark, what did you end up making an announcement? Like, what was the wording?
I did.
What did you say?
I told people that you had injured your mouth.
Injured my. That's the best.
And then you could not speak for long periods of time.
Well, that's completely
So,
accurate.
and I was like, and normally Greg talks for a very long period of time.
It's true. Yeah, I'm quite adept at that. So it was actually quite frustrating. But injured my mouth is probably the best. I kind of want to. I bit my tongue, really, really bad, like horribly bad. Actually, it took like a noticeable piece out of it.
A team of surgeons to put the tongue back together.
Injured your mouth sounds so much more. Sounds like I strained it or pulled it or something. Anyway, but so I'm fine now. But no, legit, I couldn't talk for more than a minute and a half before my tongue started burning. It was bizarre. And then turned into this big canker sore kind of area before it stopped bleeding, and then dude, it was horrid. So
it sounds horrid.
So thank you for bearing with us. But anyway, so today we are going to continue what we talked about a couple weeks ago in a slightly different fashion. We're going to talk about choice in video games and all the choices you get to make. And to start, I just want to acknowledge that literally the thing that sets games apart from other pieces of media is the fact that you get to interact with it and make choices. So just as a basis, the DNA of games is in fact choice. And so last week we talked kind of about narrative in games and your ability, how the fact that you do interact with things as a player will affect the story that gets told in the game. And I think this week we're trying to focus a little bit more just on the pure mechanics of it, how different games do that core DNA thing of giving you ways to interact with the world and how much or how little choice you have and when it works and when it doesn't. So I think in large part the format for this one, Mark and I just went through lists of best games as well as games that we've both played and enjoyed tons, so different masterpieces and with the lens of, hey, how does this game ask you to interact with it, and how much and how little and what works. So I think in large part we're gonna just kind of go through some of the better games and a few of our own favorites and talk about that. Do you have anything to add on the front end, Mark?
No, I think that's an important distinction that choice. One of the reasons why we had such a hard time with narrowing down this topic is because it encapsulates so much of what it means to be a video game.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
it's like the cornerstone of games, and so anyway.
So this week we're going to talk about how to play games,
Right. Just a disclaimer that we are going to touch on a lot of areas, and we have not decided yet on our topic for next week, but it will be more narrow in focus. So.
Yes, for sure. Because I don't think we can keep on doing things this level of abstraction. We might have hit the
too meta.
Yeah, exactly. The absolute meta-ness. But yeah, so when I was thinking about this anyway, I was thinking about one of the key things with choice, and I also have, I'll just disclose my own curmudgeon-y views on games, which is and I think I talked about the list last week, but this idea that more is better in large part, as well as that every game now needs to have just extreme customization. There's a lot of kind of buzzwords and games about well, immersive is one of them, but that's kind of tangentially related, but more just that you have total control over your character and you have meaningful, deep choices you get to make, and it's all player driven, all of these things. And right. And I don't think that's all necessary to be a great game. In fact, in my research, most of the top games of all times don't actually do that. But two, it just annoys me because so often those things we've just decided are good, and I feel a lot of times get thrown out and done really poorly, actually. So I was trying to think about one way that happens. I feel just an easy, maybe slightly lazy way that game developers, or designers rather, I feel developers, I don't want to ever call a game developer lazy because those guys work their asses off, but more maybe from the design standpoint, of just
right.
adding complexity, right? Just adding more things.
Right.
And
it's almost like
they
they said to themselves, You know what gamers love? Stuff to do. So
Yeah,
we're gonna have a lot of stuff to do.
exactly. And in some ways that can be good, right? Like large amount of content and creative versions of that. But like when you talk about like, okay, so hey, we're gonna give characters all these choices on how to play, and we're gonna give them all these different skill sets, and I'm thinking mostly in terms of like role playing games or ARPGs even. Um, and you just one as a player it can be overwhelming. But two, it can just another thing that this is just true across like most game development. I forget where this comes from, but it's the idea that constraints foster creativity, right? You actually
Hmm.
need well-defined limits to anything that you're doing in order to really thrive creatively or come up with like good problem solving. And when you have these games that just, and again, like kind of lazily, not in terms of like we'll get to like Skyrim in a second, which I think does this well, but they give you just like almost an infinite amount of things to do or ways to do it. I'm thinking kind of like of Path of Exile, which I know a lot of people really love and is really complex. Um, Certain board games I feel like fall into this. I like playing board games, and there's some games like I don't know, even like Seven Wonders to an extent. Um, where it's just a frick ton of stuff to take in and do.
Yeah, seven. I would say Seven Wonders falls in that category. Puerto Rico.
Puerto Rico, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, Puerto
yeah,
Rico's really bad for that.
yeah,
This isn't a podcast about board games, but both of those games kind of bug me because I'm
yeah,
like, I feel like I'm trying to find the game in
yeah,
this. Like,
exactly, precisely. No, that's
I
a
have
great way to put it,
actions
man.
I can take, but like, I don't know what I'm
Yeah,
doing.
or why? Yeah, no, that's a great way to put it. Is that it's so big, it's almost ill defined, right?
Hmm.
Um, and uh, and I feel like that's often thrown out as like depth. Like, hey, it's really complex. It's really like so many different ways to do it, and I'm like, and so it's really deep. And I don't think that's true. I think it's just a lot, you know? Like it makes it be
Right.
poor design in some ways. I actually, so I wrote in my show notes. I feel like Dota 2 actually does this really well in terms of there's a game that you could spend, I mean, months, if not, well, certainly years to master, but like even just learn. That can take like weeks, if not months, in terms of all the different item combinations, certainly all the different heroes or champions or whatever they call them, and the combinations there. Luckily, there's only one map, but like that is I feel like that is a highly complex game, but it's also very deep, right? I think that comes from like the fact that all those decisions are really meaningful. There's choice to it. I mean, there's choice. There's like meaning to that choice. There's consequences. There's tons of different viable ways to combine those into something that's good and fun. Um, and with that game, like you said, like it's hard to find the game. Like even if you don't know all that in Dota 2, you can hop into a game of Dota and yeah, of course, there's like fling, but at some point you can actually just get in and play the game,
Right.
and it still works, and it can still be very fun.
And I think that's like that's the problem when you run into like when you just say it's too much. I think
Exactly.
one of the concept or one of the reasons why it feels like too much is because what you can do isn't or like there isn't a really intuitive way to just play the game.
Right.
Like
Right.
if a beginner ideally can just hop into a game, there's like you know the yellow brick road, it looks good to them, it
Yeah.
plays pretty well,
Yeah.
and they can have fun doing that. And like yeah, the veteran player probably isn't going to do that. They've got their
Right.
little shortcuts and things that they want to do differently, and that's good because you want veterans to feel like they're veterans that they know more than a newbie.
Yeah.
But somebody who's new to the game, there's got to be kind of a jumping off point where like, oh, this kind of makes sense. Like I get why this would be a strategy, and I'll find other ones later.
Yeah.
But you've got to give them like the basics.
Yeah. Totally. And I think that's the difference between like just pure like depth to me, like obviously, and maybe this is why this came about, but like is you start shallow or you start on a place that makes sense, and there's always another step you can go that makes more sense and has more layers to unfold and more. But you know, it has to be kind of linear. You have to keep on going down to find it, and which means that you have to kind of keep on learning and moving. But there's always more to it, and there's always another little layer of strategic, you know, analysis you can do, or this little thing or that. I think in complex, non-deep games, that doesn't happen. It's just there's tons of stuff, and you don't like unfold or find more working parts. You just have to kind of like they don't work together too well. They don't really encourage each other, and so yeah, I think that's one area of when you talk about choice. Like yeah, it feels like you have tons of choice from all that complexity, but like you don't really actually. You just have tons of stuff, and you know the
Hmm.
choice doesn't play in. So That kind of brings me to another often talked about game, and I am one I'm playing a lot of right now. Actually, I'm just bullheadedly, or I don't know why I'm doing it, but I am. Diablo 3. Uh,
After having admitted several times on this podcast that
yeah,
you weren't sure why you kept playing it.
yeah, I know. No, I think it's just there's a goal. There's seasons in the game, and I really want to just finish this season and actually complete this task. That is one thing that seasons are good at. In Diablo 3, it's just this open-ended. I've talked about this before, but the gameplay loop is just this open-ended. Get more loot so you can run higher stuff so you can get more loot. And in seasons, which is something in the game, it gives you actual tasks to complete. And so even though those are arbitrary too, like once I finish them, they're just done, and I get a stash tab, which just allows me to hold more stuff. So even that's like not great, but at least I have really clear goals right now, and that's more fun to play. So I'm trying to finish
A,
that.
s- a stash tab sounds like some sort of cool product for facial hair. I'm trying to feel like get
Yes.
go
What would
go
that even do?
go get your stash tab.
Oh my god! I also just no one calls it stat. Like no one has advertised anything with the word stash before. Like
I think
as an abbreviation of mustache.
it's just playing too much Mario and Luigi. They talk a lot about stash it.
Yeah, it's it's the worst product name I've ever heard. Anyway, point
Anyway, what
is
were we actually talking
Diablo
about?
3
Diablo
and
3.
what I'm calling illusion of choice. Mark pointed out this is actually something slightly different. But basically, and this is also, like I said, I've been playing it and I experienced this as I'm trying to push this season. I have basically okay. So there's another thing, and it's similar to what I was talking about the complexity, but it's slightly different. The difference is in this one you have the whole game is built around um, loot and items and the combination of all those items. And in theory, most of the enjoyment or most of the game proper, like Marcus said, like finding the game, should be actually figuring out all different ways to optimize all of that loot and all those effects and make them all work together into a coherent whole that builds off each other. And that's like a big part, if not the big part of the game. And of course, there's execution past that. But in large part, the game is being able to figure that out. And the problem is that they made more items than you'll ever be able to collect, that's not the problem. But in large part, in the meta for the way the game works, there is basically what 4-ish builds combinations for each class that actually work and that you can actually be anywhere near competitive with, and not even competitive in like a set, but like completing
Not
the game,
PvP.
right? Doing well
Yeah.
in the game. And so that's another thing where you just have like all of these different ways to play. And Diablo, like I said, the reason it's slightly different is that is supposed to be the game. And it gives you all of these different effects and cool things, and even ones that would cool, like you can find like a way that all these different items interact really well, but they're just not as good as the other ones, so you'll never actually use it. You just don't.
Right.
Especially in the seasonal play, like I said, where it has specific benchmark rewards, and you just can't reach. You can't. There's only like 2 or 3 builds that you can actually do that with in a season. So that's annoying.
Right. And like you said, it kind of creates this illusion of having options, I
Hmm.
would say. Because it when you actually do the math and you realize that this choice is clearly the best one, it feels a little less like you as a player are getting to decide how you're going to play the game.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
your choice really becomes instead, do I want to advance or do I want to stay here?
No,
Because
exactly. No, that's a
if
great
I
point.
want to advance, then I have to take the better option.
Yep. No, precisely. That's a great way to put it. That is actually the choice, which is to keep on playing the game or not, which sucks too. And like, it's not even just like these ones do it better. Like I said, with the seasons right now, which is most of the game, it is literally can this work or not. It's not like I don't know. This one still works, but it's not quite as good. But I find it fun, so I'll kind of languish in lower difficulties, like I said, which the game punishes you for.
Hmm.
But in this case, it actually physically doesn't work. There's only like 3 ways to make it work. So at that point, I had this revelation where I was like, I was thinking about completing these tasks for Diablo, and I was like, okay, so what do I need to do? Like trying to think more meta. Like what do I need to work on as a player? And I realized like actually nothing. I mean, I learned my build, and I can improve there a little bit, but Unless I just have to keep on showing up and clicking, pulling the lever, like running a rift and hoping
Right.
I get stuff. And that's really all I have to do as a player. There's actually no choice involved. It's just this thing I have to keep on doing. So that is, I don't want to just keep on complaining about that game, especially in the
Especially because you keep
the
playing
high
it.
hypocrisy of me talking about it every week. But yeah, I mean and like I think the thing that hits me there, like I said, is the fact that that is supposed to be the game, is all these cool ways to play, and it's just not. So that's D3.
Yeah, it's very
I
interesting
think that
for a
dead horse is
game.
like actually in the underworld, and we might have killed its soul at this point.
Hercules went to the underworld, rescued the horse's soul, and then we sent it back.
Why Hercules?
The horse was almost out of the
Remember that scene at
underworld,
the end of the
but
animated
it looked
Hercules when
back
he
at
goes
its
into the Well of
wife.
Souls as a god?
Yeah,
He came out with the horse this
yeah.
time. Like that scene where he's like walking forward and his arms is a horse instead of Meg.
That horse is continually pushing a rock up a hill,
I know.
and then it rolls back to the bottom.
And crushes the horse.
Anyway,
That's so stupid.
it is very interesting to
It's
have a
like
game.
inserting horses into inappropriate places of Greek mythology.
Yeah, especially since the Greeks probably had a high regard for horses.
Yeah, Poseidon would have been unhappy. He was the patron of horses.
Well, it is really
It's
interesting
like
to
a
have
horse grew wings and got too close to the sun.
Oh no!
Icarus was a horse, guys.
It is really
Okay.
interesting to have a game that's like very growth focused, but then I don't know, to have it be like so competitive too. I
Yeah,
don't know. Like the meta is very strong for a game that's like mostly focused on time invested.
yeah.
Like the amount to which people optimize is still very
Huge.
high.
Yeah, that
The
was the
level
thing.
of optimization is intense. Like there are other growth focused games but they're not nearly as big as Diablo, but like Cookie Clicker, right, is like the classic
Right.
growth focused game, and like all you do is like click a cookie, but like nobody is hanging out talking about how to optimize their cookie production.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
maybe they were back when it first came out, but like people have lost interest
Right.
because the point of those games is not to just optimize the heck out of it.
Yeah.
The point is to spend time playing the game.
Yeah.
And arguably that's true about Diablo too, but there's this optimization component that comes in where like people want to be, the biggest and best and run these crazy high level riffs.
Right. And that was like partly the way I got to there was like I'm just kind of naturally competitive with games, which is funny because I don't play many competitive games, but like with my friend, like I have friends who I play Diablo with, and they're like way ahead of me, and I was like, okay, so like what are they doing better than me? Like why are they so much better at this game than me? Like what? And then I was like, wait, I don't know if they are better at this game. I think they just play more.
Mm-hmm.
Which of course that comes with other games in terms of practice and all that jazz. But like the skill cap, the skill ceiling on Diablo is actually not. I don't think it's that high, man. I really don't. So anyway, so I think that
All right.
that's a decent transition into. Oh, sorry. Do you have a point, Mark?
Nope. I was gonna say time to move on from the horse.
All right, let's do it. Yeah, let's
Bury the
find.
horse.
All right, on to a not yet dead horse. Just one we like to talk about. It's a good horse.
We like this horse.
We like this horse. Left 4 Dead 2. A zombie horse. But maybe you could talk about this a little bit. We were just talking about like again, think about choices and the choices you have to make in that game. Again, large part linear.
Mm-hmm.
And of course there's all these dynamic things that come, but there's basically like one choice you have to keep on making over and over. And that is
in the beginning of every level, it's clear that you're gonna start in the safe room and you're gonna end at another safe room.
Mm-hmm.
Like cat's out of the bag. If you've never played Left 4 Dead, sorry, I just ruined every level for you.
Yes.
That's how it goes. And everywhere in between is not safe. And so the game kicks off with this really clear choice point. It doesn't prompt you and say like, "What would you like to make this choice now?" It just puts you in a room with a bunch of gear, and then it gives you a door to the unsafe area, and it's intuitive to you as players that now I get to decide what gear I want to choose and how I prepare myself to get from this safe room to the next safe room.
Right.
And so this looks like, there's 4 different guns on the table, there's some health packs, there's maybe, some pain pills if you're lucky,
Right.
things like that, and you get to pick who gets what and how many. Most of the time, you can pick like an unlimited number of a given weapon from a safe room,
Right.
and so he's like, "Well, do we want to go all snipers? Do we want to have like a one sniper, one shotgun, and a couple mid-range guys? Like,
Right.
how exactly do we want to play this level?"
Yeah.
And that choice goes on to really impact how the unsafe region, I guess, unfolds. Like
And how you
it
interact with
really,
it, right? Yeah.
right, how you interact with it more than, because obviously that level, there's a couple dynamic elements in Left 4 Dead 2, but for the most part it's the same regardless of what you choose.
Right.
But the way that you're going to respond to those threats is largely dictated by a choice you made very early on in the level, maybe before you even knew what was going to happen. Because if it's your first time, you've never done this before, you just pick a gun that you like, and
Right.
the way that you experience that level is very much dictated by what you decided in the safe room.
And like we said, in terms of the intuition of it, we'll get there too in a little bit. I think kind of as a capstone of all these things, what we've learned, but it's super intuitive. Exactly. Like there's no text box that pops up and says like you must consider what you want to do now. Like what are here's the list of. It's just no. There's guns lying on the table and there's stuff lying on the floor, and you grab it and then you open the door. Like, and of course there's like you said like there's other guns out in the world that you can find, and so there you have tiny choices there. But in large part, the majority of the game, that level will just be what gun you picked at the beginning, or if you picked pain pills or the health pack. It's this cool little tiny build RPG-esque like building a character building that happens, and it's
Hmm.
totally intuitive. You don't think of it as character building. You don't think of it as necessarily like you don't have like a 20-second like like the beginning of Rainbow Six Siege, right? One of those matches, you have these like prepare, like this minute time period where it says like prepare for this, and you don't get that
Right.
there. You just it just is all entirely intuitive, and like you said, that totally dictates the way that the map will play out.
And we've talked about that similarly with PUBG. I don't want to move on from Left 4 Dead yet, but
Yeah.
just to tip our hat to an earlier episode where we talked about how, where you spawn, where you choose to jump out of the plane
Right.
and play around unknown battlegrounds, and what weapons you decide to pursue, or if you decide to go toward a firefight or not. I guess those are
Hmm.
all in-game decisions, but a
Yeah.
really early decision is, where do you jump out of the plane? Where do
Yeah.
you want to land
What are
in
you
the
going to invest
beginning?
in?
And so, like, do you want to get to the battleground as soon as possible? Because there's kind of a first mover advantage. Because if there's good stuff on the ground, you could get there if you jump first. Like,
Exactly.
you're going to already be on the ground. You could be looking for people who are still coming down, who are less scared than you because they've been on the ground for less time.
Yeah.
Or you can wait it out and try to get toward the end.
Yeah.
When there's less people jumping and it's sparser. And it's this will impact the next 10 minutes of you playing. But yeah, it's not the game doesn't tell you like this is a decision that's important now, prepare to make it. Like
Yeah.
it is important, and if you don't realize it is, you will eventually after playing enough.
Yeah, yeah, no, precisely, and that's again, that's kind of like the organic way that that's built into that game is that like you will begin to if as just through iteration and consequence, your choices have clear consequences, then you'll begin to figure that out as a player, and that's that's there's other varied levels too. Like in that case, that's a pretty implicit one. Like you'd have to think for a second, put together, oh, maybe this is the reason that I keep on losing is because I'm making this choice at the beginning of the game, as opposed to say like a game you're playing, it's like an RPG or something, and you're fighting a boss and you die, and then the game like says like you don't have enough fire damage. Like this boss is like has a weakness to fire. Like it's direct, like obviously, yeah, your choice has consequence, and the game is like being very upfront with like why. Um, and I think there's various levels to that. I think we've come down on the side of, in general, the more clear the consequences are, the game makes it, the better it is for the player. But hopefully, it wouldn't have to be in like a text box form. It would be more organic than that,
Yeah,
where
I
it
would say
reinforces something.
I would say that's a case of like a kind of a band-aid over a deeper problem in
Right.
that encounter. Like if it's not intuitive to the player, like you've sort of failed to communicate that.
Yeah, yeah.
Like
The
and
game,
so
what
it's
the game is, what the system is.
right. So like the text box is like fine, you can do that, but I would not say that that's like that's the great way to do it. Like I understand there are other
Yeah,
constraints on game design and sometimes you need a text box.
right.
But ideally, like the player would understand that, oh, this, I would either you give them the ability to try other things, or
Yeah,
there'd be some sort of more intuitive indication that isn't going to be so immersion breaking
yeah.
as having somebody come in and tell you how to play the game that you're
Precisely
playing.
what it is. Yeah. No,
You want
I
the
agree
player to
entirely.
feel like they are figuring out how to play the game.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's another great point. Yeah, exactly. I mean, games are also, like we were talking about, just the DNA is choice. Another DNA is yeah, the reason you want to be doing this because you want to feel powerful, you want to feel in control, you want to actually be the person driving things. And you're right. If a developer has to like takes that away from you, yeah, if they tell you how to play it, even if they're correct, that makes you feel less like you actually achieved something or in control, as opposed to like you getting to figure that out. So I think that's another
Right.
important and
Like,
probably just unbelievably difficult thing to design into a game is that natural feedback loop that feels organic.
right.
And
It's
to
all
bring it back to Left 4 Dead, I
it's
think it actually does it very well in that game.
yeah, it's about like subtlety and like trying to subtly communicate things. Like
Yeah,
instead of having a text box, someone to say like you should use fire attacks. Have this enemy that you encounter. Maybe at the beginning when they're doing their bad guy monologue, they say something about how they dislike flame or something like even something like that is more is it's informative to the player without feeling patronizing.
right. Or in the encounter, right, having flame spurt out of the ground and the boss shies away from it, looks fearful,
Yeah, yeah,
that sort
that's
of thing,
great.
right?
Hmm.
The little things like that that are like, hey, he doesn't seem to like fire, and then you use a fire attack and he starts screaming. But uh, maybe that's a more extreme version. Maybe we don't have to just yeah, he's on fire. Of course he's going to scream. Anyway, um, so yeah, so that was kind of what we were thinking about Left. Anything else you want to say about Left 4 Dead? I think it's cool too, just the fact that that game is usually played cooperatively, and so those choices become part of the like when you, me, and Xander play at the beginning, we'll like talk about what everyone's going and what's best, and it's this kind of communal thing that brings us together for a second. And then if we keep on losing, we're like we'll problem solve.
Right. We'll pick different weapons, and I mentioned this to you, but it reminds me of I love Chaos series, so it reminds me of the butterfly effect of just
Oh yeah,
like which there's more to Chaos theory than this, but I won't go into it now.
read
But
Jurassic Park.
extreme sensitivity to initial conditions is one of the things that make a system chaotic.
Right.
And I would say that Left 4 Dead 2, there is, I don't know if it's an extreme sensitivity, but there's certainly a sensitivity to what gear you decide to pick in the beginning, and that allows for the game to unfold in a different way and feel fresh and different and new, even though the level is pretty static. And
Yeah.
some of that is because of the way that they did the director system, which we've already talked about. But
Right.
I think the beginning choice helps with that too. Pokemon, similar. You get to
Sure.
pick your
Sure.
starter.
It's a great point.
You pick. It's a pretty big change in the first 2 to 3 hours of the game.
Yeah.
What starter you choose,
Yeah.
and arguably the entire game is different. But I would say it's very very noticeable in the beginning.
Yeah. Definitely most
Um,
obvious.
and then you might not even know the ways that it's going to be different,
Yeah.
right? You might not even realize that you may have picked Charmander and then not realized that your first boss was going to be a rock gym leader,
Right.
and that actually that was a
Rock and
terrible
water.
decision. And
Yeah, it's not the
uh,
best example in terms of yeah, because there's no possible way to know that if you've never played Pokemon before.
right, no, there isn't. But I think that like a person who picked Charmander right off the bat is going to go into a conversation with somebody who picked Squirtle, and they're going to have very different perspectives on what the first part of the game is like. Like, oh my gosh, the first gym leader was so hard, but after that, like
Even though
it got a bit easier after I got through Brock and Misty, which is like good luck. Like you just
yeah,
got
yeah,
punished in the beginning,
yeah,
but after that, things get a bit easier. Whereas somebody who picked with Bulbasaur, it's gonna be easy in the beginning. It's gonna get harder later.
right. And hopefully, I was talking about it's not too intuitive initially, but then hopefully, after as you're fighting, and there's only so much you can do. But hopefully, as you're fighting Rock with your fire type, and you keep on seeing that it sucks and you lose, you'd be like, oh, okay, maybe I need a different type of Pokemon here. Like, you don't just
Mhm.
keep on trying to throw fire at it, right?
Right.
It begins naturally teaching you in the worst way possible, as opposed to the more fun way, which is like, oh, look, your Pokemon is super effective. This is how types work. With Charmander, it's more your Pokemon suck. Here's how types work. Fix it.
Yes,
You know.
exactly.
So
And
that's still actually is a learning moment built into the game that works.
And to Pokemon's credit, like I talked about the evils of text boxes when, especially the early Pokemon games where you just don't have a lot of subtlety and a Game Boy,
Right,
like
or ability
you
to
know.
convey. Yeah, yeah,
So having them have a text box saying either it's not very effective, it's super effective, or like it's just normally effective, um, I think is fine. And because it happens with every single move, it doesn't feel patronizing.
yeah,
It isn't like after you
yeah,
get stuck, the game starts helping you and is like, by the way,
yeah,
fire attacks aren't
yeah,
very good against this type.
yeah. It also is good that they don't have a normally effective, like,
Yeah,
uh,
when pop up.
every single
Yeah.
attack. But no,
Yes.
I totally agree that it's a staple of the game. It's not something that you get thrown at once you start doing poorly. It's just everyone always gets that always, no matter what. So,
Right.
and that seems important to me in terms of that level. And I think too, just to go back to Left 4 Dead 2 for just one more second, the fact that the loadouts, you only have like one or two things to actually choose, right? That you don't have like 18 billion things to actually choose in the room. You just have like three, and that's like enough. So I want to push back again against the idea of complexity as like just being more depth. It's like no, actually, you can experience meaningful, deep choice with a very, very limited amount of possibilities, variation, and
One game that doesn't actually, I guess it's really a whole genre that doesn't appear to have that much choice is puzzle games.
right,
But Greg brought up the very interesting point that in a puzzle game, you don't feel that absence of choice because of the combinatorial nature of puzzle solving. There's so many different ways to approach the puzzle that you still have the experience of making a lot of choices, even though there's only one solution. And a game that does this very, very well is Portal. Now, I realize that with a few of the levels, there are like people you'll see in speedruns that do crazy things, and
yeah,
there are, in fact, other ways to solve a couple of the puzzles.
yeah,
But for most, plebeians like ourselves,
yeah,
we can solve the Portal puzzles one or maybe two ways.
right,
And so it's pretty limited into what the solution space is. But because you can put a portal anywhere, it feels like there's a lot of autonomy for you as the player.
yeah,
Um, and so I would say that it gives you a lot of uh, the experience of choice without ever actually having to create a lot of different forking pathways for
yeah,
things. It just it comes up with a very clear set of rules, and it puts you in an environment where you can use them.
mm-hmm.
And that is really the definition of player autonomy.
Yeah,
Even though there's really in puzzle games just one right way to use those tools
mm-hmm.
for a lot of the portal levels anyway.
Yeah,
And so I think it's an incredibly fun game. Obviously, it did very, very well, and uh, I think that was a good example of how you don't have to present a lot of really complicated story arcs and these quote unquote consequence based decisions
right,
in order to make choice an important part of your game.
yeah,
You can still have a clear entry and exit point, but if you give the player a choice about how they get from A to B, that can be enough
yeah,
for the choice in the game to be enjoyable, even if there really is just one way to get from A to B.
precisely. And it's the same. Like I like the way you said that. In this case, I mean, somewhat semi-similar, like you were talking about. Like there's a solution state that you need to find. And the other thing I think you touched on it all, but the other thing about Portal is that it's you're not punched at all for trying things. Like it's so easy to put in new portals, and if you die, like respawning is very, very quick and easy. Like it encourages and incentivizes trying different things and utilizing creativity and making different decisions, as opposed to making it really difficult. So I think that's really important. And part of why that game succeeded so well was that it was a really accessible puzzle game. And your ability to make choices, the game made it feel very, very real, very yeah, like that was what you're supposed to do. And again, it was very organic, and just the way the smoothness of the portal gun itself and the mechanics of the way it worked. So I think that was a cool way that worked. Let's
Yeah, I
see.
think I think a low cost for failure is important in a game like that. Like if it was really punishing and even if like failure was a really time consuming endeavor in Portal,
Yeah,
I think it would make it a lot less fun. Because the whole game is to explore the solution space,
yeah,
right? Like there and arguably it is with any game because games are about problem solving. But
right.
it's very clear in Portal like you need to get to this door and there are many ways you could try to do that.
Yeah,
And so you've got to be able to you got to have that feedback loop be pretty quick.
yeah,
Like,
real type.
put a portal there. I went through the portal. Oh yeah, I didn't realize there was an obstacle there. It's not going to work. Okay, back to the beginning.
Right, right. Yeah. Or even, I meant like even the execution. Like I placed this portal poorly. Let me just right click again without any consequence whatsoever, and immediately it'll be corrected.
Right.
Um, they didn't make it very very low barrier of entry to the and yeah, the controls are really simple. You have WSID and a right and left click basically. Like it was very very basic
Mm-hmm.
game. No customization whatsoever. I might note, and it still worked. So. Um, so I don't know. So I think I want to talk about Brood War just for a second. Again, we're talking about like kind of masterpiece games, and
Mm-hmm.
well, StarCraft Remastered just came out a couple weeks ago, I think, and so I've been watching more Brood War and getting to understand it and actually playing it. And wow, it's a cool game.
That
Uh,
explains all the Brood War hype. I went on to Twitch the other day and I'm like, man, what's going on? Is there like a Brood War tournament happening somewhere?
yeah,
And
yeah, the remastered I
it's the
think is.
remastered. That makes
I wonder if
sense.
that's going to revitalize actually the scene as a whole, man. I mean, because people still that Brood War is still being played professionally in
Oh
certainly in
yeah.
Korea, and I think there's a small U.S. scene still, but but a lot of the old kind of pros and people who had retired or moved on to StarCraft 2 are coming back to Brood War because of the remastered, and so I wonder if we'll see a resurgence in that. But anyway, so the cool thing about this game and choice is, and what we were talking about, this kind of goes into other themes that we've been talking about, but um, so Brood War is primarily, it's an RTS. It's primarily competitive in this case, and we'll get to this when we talk briefly about things that didn't work too well. But I think in large part, a lot of games that are competitive, like multiplayer, like FPSs or most RTSs, honestly, um, fail pretty hard at choice for some of the reasons we've talked about before, where there's tons of different things in a game that is competitive. You want to just naturally the game rewards you for optimization, and it's very very difficult to make a lot of things be equally viable in a game competitively, and and so hence you kind of get funneled into one or two things that work perfectly, and I think that kills a whole lot of, again, I think a lot of the supposed appeal to those games, particularly RTSs, where you're supposed to have this large, certainly maybe even different factions, large breadth of things. Anyway, Brood War basically does this very very well, where they created a game that was for the initial choice, the state choice, you have a map, and then only three choices for a race. You have three factions that are all wildly different, and then once you're in, the game's designed in a way that it's not necessarily like a you build this, hence it's not like what RTS or competitive people talk about, like rock paper scissors as much, where hey, you've built this thing, hence the correct response for me is to build this. Like there's not too much
Right.
choice there, right? It's just knowledge.
Right.
Brood War does really well is and Day9, who I talk about a lot, Sean Plott, who's a professional Brood War player and a very successful broadcaster and streamer. Really intelligent guy too. He's worked as a designer as well. But he talks about Brood War. It's it not being as much as you build this, I build this to counter it. It's more you just have tons of tools in a toolbox. Every unit and ability in Brood War is more a tool that can be utilized in certain ways. And recognizing which tools to use at the right times, of course, is going to be essential. Like if Terran's going Mass Marine, then Storm is as Protoss makes sense, right? There are things that do well against other things, but it's not so simple as the only thing to do when your opponent builds Marines is to build High Templar to get Storm. That's there's a huge range of strategic depth, and again, that's like I think that is true depth, where you're able to look at a problem and have multiple ways to have a solution depending on the way that you want to go about it. And I think that's why Brood War succeeded so well, was so successful, because it wasn't boring to watch as a viewer. If you saw this coming out and it was a very rock paper scissory game, then you just know, hey, this guy's going to do this, and whoever does it faster is going to win.
Right.
Um, it was far more, no, how's this guy going to decide to respond to? There's a lot of back and forth, actually, play counterplay, kind of the mirror of that consequence dynamic in single player gameplay, where you have pretty immediate consequences to your actions, and then you'll see counterplay from the other person, then you immediately have another decision to make on how to respond to that. And so I think that's, and particularly as a strategy game, as an RTS, real-time strategy, Brood War was pretty darn unique in that a large amount of actual strategy was into the game. Most RTSs I tend to think of more as like real-time tactics, or just kind of real-time who can utilize mechanics better. And of course, there's a big part of that to Brood War too. But in large part, Brood War was also extremely about the style. We'll talk about style more so. That was used to get to victory, and then how to adapt that style or transition between different things. That leads to this super deep and engaging and fun to watch gameplay, because you never know exactly what's going to happen. And like I said, I think a lot of other RTSs and FPSs in terms of multiplayer, where you have all these different guns and attachments and perks and all this jazz, but only a few have been optimized for competitive play. And if you want to be good at it, then you have to do this. StarCraft's not like that. Brood War's not like that. If you want to be good, there's a lot of different ways to be good. Ooh, in a rant. That was one breath, I think. I don't know how to breathe. Let me just get some water. Tasty tap water.
Breathe. Yeah, well, up in Michigan, they actually have tasty tap water.
Is that not true down south?
No, it tastes like sulfur. I live in
Oh,
Florida.
wow.
I
Good
live in a
Lord.
bog. Oh, yeah.
Oh, that's true. You do live close to the swamps. That makes sense.
Yeah.
That sucks.
I'm trying to think about, like, we discussed Puerto Rico earlier, and
Right.
how when you give a player so many options, it can feel like it's hard to know the path to take.
Right.
And I do think that RTSs in general suffer from that. Like, anybody
They
who's
do.
played a game and looked at the tech tree like for the first time, then they're like, what in the world do I build?
Precisely.
I
And Brood War
definitely
suffers from
felt
that as
like
well,
that.
actually. If you try to jump into a ladder match, competitive 1v1 is in Brood War, you'll just get murdered and you won't know why, and it'll be confusing. So it
Right.
does not do that too well.
But I think for competitive play, that actually can end up being a good thing later
Yeah.
on. Like, I think it's undeniably bad for new players. Like, it makes it
Yeah.
very hard to approach. It makes
Yeah.
a high learning curve,
Yeah.
but it also gives you a pretty high skill ceiling, which
Yeah.
is nice.
Yeah, for sure. And for us, I also don't know, I haven't thought about this much, but I'm just trying to think. Like, do you think Puerto Rico has a high skill ceiling? Because it's so
Potentially,
complex? Like,
potentially.
I don't
I'm
know if
not
it
good
does.
enough at Puerto Rico to know.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, we haven't learned the game enough. But like, I don't think that necessarily implies high complexity implies a high skill ceiling too. Like,
No,
I think
no,
Brood
I don't think
War.
it does. It could be a really like, well, I'm just thinking of search trees in my head from like a computer science standpoint, but like
Mhm.
it could just be a large, like a very wide search space, but not a very deep one, if that
Right,
makes sense.
right.
There could be a lot of options, but then once you figure out which one wins, that's the
Yeah,
one to go for.
yeah,
So I don't, yeah, they don't necessarily go together.
yeah. That makes sense. Yeah, and so yeah, so Brood War is really good in that regard in terms of even in real time, right? As you're going again, there's no like your opponent has made lots of zealots. How are you going to respond? Obviously, that doesn't happen.
Right.
Is just an immense amount, and Dota 2 similar to this, like we were talking about. It's the reason I think these two were so successful as esports and continue to be is that they're. I mean, think of people compare it to high speed, legitimately high speed chess. Um, with like 18 different boards, and like if you had 20 different types of pieces instead of however many there are, like 6. um it's so there's so much actual meaningful choice that needs to happen at every moment in those games, that makes it so engaging, so good to practice, as well as so fun to watch if you know what you're watching. It's really hard to watch Dota if you don't know what you're watching. Same thing with Brood War. Without good commentators, it'll just usually look like one player just won. They killed more things and they won. Um, and that's not too fun to watch, obviously. But being able to understand the game and actually see the choices involved, I think that's partially too why esports. It's pretty clear when you get to watch football, even if you don't understand the strategy to it. When someone makes like a one-handed catch in the end zone, you're like, "Holy crap, that was incredible!"
That was
I
really
don't, I don't, I
cool.
don't need to understand
Yeah.
anything about football to be entertained and amazed by this feat. It's very
Right.
difficult for esports to actually do that, in the same way.
But I
Uh,
think that the people, at least the people that I know who I feel like really enjoy even football, it's because they understand the complexities that teams are like engaging in. They
yeah,
understand the decisions that the quarterback is making, that the coach is making.
yeah,
And when they see the people making those decisions, it's interesting to them in a way that it isn't interesting to me
yeah,
because I don't know. I've never played football with any depth, so
yeah,
I just don't really understand the game that well. So when I see them line up at the line of scrimmage, I'm like, oh look, they're lining up again.
yeah,
Not like,
yeah,
oh, they're in a shotgun formation and the
yeah,
other
yeah,
team has got two safeties far back. This will be interesting.
yeah,
Like
yeah,
because
yeah,
because I just don't know that much.
yeah,
And so I do think that real appreciation of a game um, comes from understanding the decision points when you can make a decision that's important,
yeah.
and then obviously the
And
execution
the
piece,
potential, yeah,
which you have already talked about, where it's like the execution is a little bit easier to appreciate because it's like, well, they got a goal, so
yeah.
like that's great.
And that's even, again, similarly, if it's a little bit different because athletic prowess tends to be more highly valued in society. But like, if you ever watch like the keyboard cams for Korean professionals in Brood War and the speed that they're hitting stuff, if they're hitting like
Right.
400 APM actions per minute, which is insane.
Yeah.
That's insane to watch. Like you can look at that and be like, how is he comprehending? And each one of those is going to be a unique order in large part. Like how in the world is he moving his mind moving that quickly and he's manipulating this entire world? That's cool to watch too.
Hmm.
So so I think that definitely makes sense. And I think so. Let's see, how much time do we got? Yeah, like 15 minutes. Um, want to talk about Breath of the Wild a little bit for a sec?
Yeah, we can do that. I want to make sure we
I
hit
think it's a unique one.
BioShock too. So
Yeah, 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 yeah. Bioshock's important. Well, we talk about Breath of the Wild briefly. I don't think we actually have as much to talk on that one as maybe some of the others.
yeah. Well, with we Breath of the Wild almost came out of my mouth earlier when we were talking about just more stuff because
Yeah,
while it has received a lot of praise and I think rightly so, it's a good game.
totally.
One of the things it's been knocked for has been the shrines,
Right.
of which
Yep.
there are a lot, and it is just more stuff.
God
Like
Almighty. Yeah.
because as a player, you're the only decision you really need to make is do I want to get all the shrines or do I not want to get all the shrines?
Yeah.
After you make that decision, there isn't too much left to decide.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah. You
it's
just keep on showing. It's kind of like Diablo, right? Like you just have to keep on showing up.
yeah, it's more just time invested and like there are some of the shrines that are difficult to get to and there's some problem solving in and of themselves. But the
Right.
experience of visiting the shrine and what it's going to do for you is
Right.
pretty similar.
Yeah.
Um,
Especially at the point of like, at that point, you're probably going to push all the shrines. You've probably explored most of the world, right? Like, you're not
Right.
finding
And that's
new.
what it's supposed to do for you. It's supposed
Yeah,
to give you an excuse to explore the world. Okay, well, there's something to be said for when you climb up a mountain and at some level and nothing is there and you worked
right,
really hard to get there. It's
right.
kind of disappointing as a player.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
don't
totally.
think I don't think a great solution to that is to put what is kind of the equivalent to a Quest McDonald's at the top of every
Yeah,
mountain. Like it's
yeah,
like, oh, another McDonald's.
yeah,
It's just like all the other McDonald's.
yeah,
Um, and so I understand, think what they were trying to accomplish there in terms of rewarding exploration. I
hmm
think the rewards could have been a bit more varied. But anyway, there are a lot of things that the game does right with regard to choice. So let's talk about those.
yeah. I mean, I think the uniqueness in Breath of the Wild was, we've been talking about other games that give you, and we haven't gotten to Deus Ex, which sucks because that's a great example of ways to different ways to beat the same exact challenge in vastly different game mechanical ways. So like combat versus stealth versus hack versus puzzle versus create exploration, whatever. Breath of the Wild doesn't do that as much, it seems to me, although there is some definitely some level of that just natural to a good RPG. But more so, I think the thing that sets it apart is the fact that it's more you part of the game is choosing how to experience the game, right? Like it was unique in that from the first second you start, you can actually go and you can attack and kill Ganon. That's like the first quest you get is the last quest, and that ends the game. Um,
Hmm.
or ends the story at least. And and there's also no clear progression in terms of which area to go to. Obviously, it's soft gated in terms of different abilities that you have or strength that you need to have to get to different areas. And oh my lord, is that a raccoon? Oh no, no, that's two geese.
A Raken?
Oh, raccoon. Yeah, no, no, no. Sorry, that was a weird. I'm looking outside and There's a playground right outside my window, and I thought there's just a raccoon chilling like right near this child's playground, and it's like 3:30 p.m. But no, it was two geese, in a really weird position that looked legitimately raccoon-like. So anyway, no. So with Breath of the Wild, yeah, you don't have it doesn't force you into areas necessarily. It gives you so the game becomes as much about playing the game as like how you want to experience the game. Like that choice is the big choice. It's not like necessarily what steps am I going to take to complete these objectives. It's hey, how do I even want to think about um, completing this game? Like it's kind of a meta
Uh-huh.
sense of the game.
I
Um,
think like when I think about playing having if I played Breath of the Wild blind, like I didn't consult anything,
right.
I think you could actually make it a really enjoyable experience for the player to you could either give them a sense of what it might be like to fight Ganon or
Hmm.
sort of because I'm thinking like if you just go have that fight immediately, just
Right.
go fight him, see how badly you get beaten, why you get beaten badly, and then you've got in your head like these are the areas I need to compensate for, and this is the gear that I need, and
Yeah.
then the rest of your game can just be going through this beautiful world that Nintendo created
And trying to
that
find that. Yeah.
yeah, that presumably has some of these tools that you
Yeah.
need.
Yeah.
Um, and then going to fight Ganon with those
Yeah.
tools, and you see how you did, and there's a nice feedback loop there.
Hmm.
But I think a game that has got a really complex final encounter like that
Yeah.
could really, really thrive off of a system like the one in Breath of the
Yeah.
Wild, because the more complexity that's in that fight, the more now you need to go into this huge world they created and find interesting tools to deal with specific sections of that fight.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. That's a great point. That's a really interesting way to incentivize players to explore and get things rather than just the sheer joy of exploring in a world that is beautiful. And that's definitely enough for most players, if not all of them. I mean, Breath of the Wild is just gorgeous and you want to explore because it's awesome. But
right.
past that, even if you think just purely mechanically, how do I beat this game? Is a great point of like, hey, you seeing all of these things that you're falling short on, unless you want to go like full Nintendo Dark Souls and beat it without anything, which people do and can do, which is insane to me. But yeah, that it actually gives you complete incentive as a player to be going out and finding all these different things. That's a really cool thought. I like that a lot. I wonder if they thought about that in the design, or and I also wonder how many people go to fight Ganon initially, right off the bat. Probably not many.
Yeah, because I think that would be like my intuitive path through the game. Would be like
Yeah,
if I'm taking this game seriously, and that like what I mean is my goal is just to beat it. Like my goal is to finish this game.
right.
Then I think the clear first step is just go and see what you're up against.
Yeah, I mean that's problem solving, right? If you just kind of attack it as a problem, get as much data, scout.
Right. I think some games do this in kind of a campy way where they have you lose the first encounter so you can kind of like quote unquote see what you're up against so that when you fight them later you can beat them it feels like you've progressed a bunch.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
it's not a legit like they were unbeatable in the first encounter and now like you're allowed to beat them. It isn't
right.
like a
Yeah, it's not an
true
actual
it isn't true
challenge.
progression of the player that is like making the whole difference.
Yeah,
It's also
yeah,
the fact that this time they have a health bar and last time they didn't.
right. And they were
Um,
balanced to be beaten this time.
Exactly. And so, players can sense that. But if you legitimately have a fight where, no, I mean, if you figure out if we made a mistake or this fight is winnable on the first round, then the game is over. I think that's a very different experience for the player because then it feels like, okay, what needs to improve? What do I need to practice skill wise? What gear do I need?
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know, if he's got some wicked fire attack, okay, I need to find some fire resist armor.
right, right, precisely. Well, we got like a few minutes left. I don't know if we're gonna be able to touch on everything else. I think I want to just talk about real quick a couple of ideas, and I'll hint on. And I mean, we other ones want to talk about were Shadow of the Colossus and Journey, the games. There's almost no choice involved in those at all. You just need to experience them, and those turn out to be unbelievably good games.
Yeah.
And then Bioshock, of course, is one of my favorite games of all time. Might be one of the games I've played the most, honestly, just in terms of hours. I've played that game. I've 100%ed, and played through on every difficulty and yada yada yada. Um, and that's a great one that overlaps with last week's in terms of talking about narrative and morality.
Right.
This one I think is unique in that it is actually I feel like semi primarily the way that you I think it's primarily gameplay. Those choices, basically, the way you get your main resource in that game is by quote unquote rescuing little girls. and then you can either get a lot of your resource by killing them and executing them, or you can get less of your resource but save them. And that is it sounds as disturbing as it is, or is as
Right.
disturbing as it sounds, but also plays really heavily with your mind in terms of the way you want to be playing the game. So that's a great example of your choices. One, having heavy, because like I said, that's kind of their primary resource to power up in large part, is getting this atom, is what it's called. And so it has massive consequences in the way you're going to play the game. And you get that choice multiple times. It's not just a one and done. So you have to keep on either killing these girls to get more powerful, or like, releasing them and letting them survive and be slightly underpowered. So that game does give you a very, very tight gameplay consequence to it. But it's also, like I said, just even describing it, much less having to do it in game, is super affecting to the player, and it does affect the story as well a little bit. I think it's fascinating in that you do get different endings depending on how you treated the little sisters throughout the game. But I think in large part, the major consequence of the more important moral and narrative consequence of the game, I feel like, is actually just the way you experience it throughout the game. Because there's a lot more of that. There's a difference between a 90-second cutscene at the end versus having to do that, over 30 hours. As well as, just like I said, just that game's also unbelievably good at immersion, and so putting yourself in those shoes and actually learning something about your character by the way he treats these defenseless girls, is really, really powerful narrative device, and doesn't feel cheap. So BioShock does that incredibly well. So that was one of the masterpieces that uses choice a ton and was really important. I think that might have been part of the reason why it became such a big byword. Come to think of it, when you think about the timetables, that was like mid 2000s and early PS3, Xbox 360 days, and yeah, that's why I wonder if that was part of it. That this unbelievably good choice gameplay and narrative mechanism was put into the game, and people were like, dude, and people loved it, and devs saw that and were like, hey, people seem to respond to this, and then tried, and in large part didn't quite match the intensity and tightness, like I said, of the mechanic.
Well, and I don't want to go too much back into the ground we covered last week, but in BioShock, when it comes to how you're going to, um, I guess, interact with the little sisters, you've got this question that comes up again and again of, do I kill this one? Like,
Right.
maybe I killed the last one. Do I want to kill another one?
Yeah.
Like, and so you're having to face this decision again and again, and it's a tough decision the first time, but by the 10th or 12th, it's like, man, you're really having to wrestle with what kind of a person, what kind of a world do I inhabit, where
Yeah.
what's more important to me is this atom and not these girls.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean that's precisely the whole. That's another great. Again, we talked about like kind of mirroring themes and a narrative with the gameplay mechanics, and that's like the whole theme of the game, right? Like that's the whole point of like Rapture and the experiment and of Rapture and how it failed so miserably as you let these people loose with something to basically genetically enhance and change people as they are, and how that people can handle that, and all the different myriad ways that went south, because it went south in a lot of different ways. So that's another great, it underlines the theme of the game with a personal narrative and a gameplay mechanic, which is just, God, that's good, man. All the different hits that all the boxes that checks. So I think, let's see here, what time? I think we're about done, right? Well, I mean, I
Yeah.
would say I've got a few minutes. I don't know, I'd say as we were talking about this and going through all these different games and trying to find some theme, I think one of the really important thing, and actually Mark and I both came to this independently, which is always a good sign. But I'm pretty sure in general, the best games, that handle choice, and do it really well. And like we said, this is like all games to an extent. But I think part of the thing about really, really good games is that they don't let you know you're making choices, or at least don't make it obvious.
Right.
It is hard baked into the DNA of the game to the extent that you are continually making choices, and meaningful ones that actually will affect your later decisions, and affect the game as it stands. But you aren't necessarily entirely aware of it. Obviously, there's these decision points in games, particularly narratively, that you have to be aware of. But you think just mechanically, I think the best games are, yeah, the ones that you are going to have that really ingrained feedback loop where you make a decision and you see the consequences, and you make a different one, and you're not entirely aware of it. Like, um, I thought about at least the Civilization games, where those are like, you don't really think about the amount of decisions you make in those games, but they're huge. There's so many things to do, and there's so many different ways to do them, and and you just make one, and then that'll build upon. And it's linear. There's progression to it, but it's so well designed into the UI and just the, like I said, the DNA of the game, the core gameplay mechanics, that you keep on making them over and over, and they feel really really natural. It's a little bit hard to do that. I mean, RPGs with character creation and design, it's the same thing. You should feel, obviously you'll have skill trees and whatnot. That takes you out a little bit, but in large part, I think it should be something that's very organic, very natural. Feels normal to want to be doing this based on the way you've been playing the game, and want to continue playing the game. Um, Even like the way Skyrim did it, where you like the skill trees are constellations, so you actually pan up from your view and look into the sky. That's a nice little kind of touch to like keep immersion. Same thing with Bioshock. It's completely necessary to the narrative of what you do with the Little Sisters. It's not just like a arbitrary text box that pops up.
Right.
And you keep on making these choices over and over, and it changes the way you play the game.
It reminds me of, this was from a completely different context, but the importance of showing and not telling
Yeah,
a
basically.
player. Um, I think is important in games. Like you said, games are sort of the material. It's the medium you're working with, really, in a game,
Yeah,
and so how you use that is very important to how good of a game you make. And when you can allow for the player to experience these choices and to understand the choices available to them without having to tell them,
yeah,
um, I think that that's really where games shine, especially mechanically. Now, for for the story part, then there is a little bit more telling that has to happen, and a little bit more, um,
yeah.
I guess, obvious choices. Like, okay, there is a couple of games. I forget the game right now, but there are a couple of games where your responses are timed. Like, it gives you a set of things to say, but you
Heavy
only
Rain
have
does that.
oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Where like your dialogue options are timed, and I think
Right.
that's a way to prevent dialogue trees from kind of breaking immersion of the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, we've already talked about some of the
Yeah,
reasons why you kind of need to have dialogue trees.
yeah,
But
precisely.
mechanically, I think the less telling and the more showing you can do for players, the better.
Totally.
I was really um, impressed by the first hour or so of Red Dead Redemption, and just how they walked you through all the things that your character could do and the different mechanics, and how horse riding is going to work, and how shooting your gun is going to work, and just
Yeah,
all these different systems that they introduced to you. Um, it felt a little bit tutorially, but it wasn't super heavy-handed. And,
yeah.
and I really appreciate when games don't, it doesn't feel like you're just straight up having to grind through this terrible set of dialogue boxes to figure out how to play the game.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, man, I agree with that, and that makes sense to me. Again, like as we're talking, choices are the thing that makes a game a game. So, in theory, the way they handle that should be what makes it a game or not. And and it makes sense to me too. Then that if you are able to make players make choices, and a lot of them, and meaningful, and they don't know they're making them, then that's probably what makes a good game. Just that's a really probably reductionist viewpoint of it, but
Well, and
I
it,
think there might be some truth to just that underlying part.
and as we've always said, like, games are an experience, and so you've got to make sure that the choices you're presenting to the player augment the experience you're trying to let them have.
Right.
And so, for a Heavy Rain, for example, you want to fall heavy. You want to heavily accent the choices, the narrative choices, right?
Yeah.
Like, you don't want to have a whole mission just figuring out how do I get downtown.
Right.
Like, do I want to call a cab? Do I
Navigation,
want to try to like find how the
exploration.
local bus system works? And like
Right.
like there's all sorts of tangential stuff they could have put in that game, but they want the choices to complement the experience you're having, which is
Right.
to figure out be a father trying to figure out what happened to his son.
Precisely. And yeah, on that note, I think it's one thing I was thinking about what makes classic, because again, like I said, part of the way I was doing this was looking through lists of the best games and think about my favorites and huge classics like Super Mario Brothers and the original Doom, Half-Life, the Metroid games, Halo, Chrono Trigger, that sort of thing. And what makes these games the masterpieces they are. And again, if we're going with my little thesis that choices and the way games handle choices are a big part of that, then how these games did it. And I think another thing outside of that, that initial kind of like thesis we talked about in terms of a lot of choices without being obvious. Another big part of it, I think, that they can't be understated in terms of like masterpieces or classic games is the lightning in the bottle innovation effect too of games, really successful ones, giving you new ways to make decisions that you hadn't ever got to experience in games before. Like Ocarina of Time, Zelda is a great example of that in terms of the 3-dimensional combat. Suddenly you have to be thinking about combat in a way different way than you ever had. And just the time portion, it was an entirely new area of your brain you had to access for thinking about how to make choices. And if you go back, that game's aged all right. I don't think it's aged great, in large part because so many other games have now utilized those systems.
Right, right.
Hence,
it's like watching Citizen Kane. That might be a reference that's lost on most people, but it's a
I
very
actually have not seen
old,
Citizen Kane.
it's a very old, very classic, highly regarded film.
Right,
But you can't appreciate all the things it does well because now everybody does them.
right,
So
and
you're like, oh, it like zoomed into his face in a dramatic moment. Like
yeah,
everybody does that.
precisely. Right, and exactly, and that's the equivalent for the what was the comparison you made to the film media we were talking earlier
Oh,
before the show about
yeah.
like
Well, I think, when
oh yeah saying
we've been
like
talking
yeah go
about
ahead
choice
yeah
and when games really advertise how much choice is involved in their game, because every game involves choice, it just kind of reminds me of a movie trying to sell itself on the grounds that it's going to have moving pictures.
yeah
Like,
exactly.
it's the definition
Look
of a
how many
game. Of
moving
course your
pictures we
game
have here.
has choice.
Yeah,
Like,
it's like advertising a movie based on how many shots there are in it.
right, it's
So
ridiculous.
like no what.
Or like trying to sell a book based on the number of words.
Yeah,
It's like
yeah,
that is not what makes a good story.
yeah, exactly. So, and I think yeah, unfortunately or fortunately, with some of these old games, and the classics, quote unquote, they were so good because of the fact that they gave you no choice. Same thing like Halo is a good example of the original Halo Combat Evolved being again, you go back and play it, and it hasn't aged great. Still a lot of fun, but in large parts because there's like it defined modern FPS. That
Right.
game did, and and yeah, that was hugely original and fun, and all the different choices you got to make in it were unique in terms of like the way you fought with the idea of like regenerating shields or regenerating your health, the idea of like vehicles, kind of more open-ended levels as opposed to super like linear hallways and stuff. Um,
Right.
those are all staples of FPS now. At the time, it was new ways to engage with a game. It was new decisions to make as a player that we'd never gotten to make before, and people flipped out and appropriately. So
Mm.
I think innovation of games is probably again we're just two dudes, so if we ever sound like we know too much, just shut that down. But I'd wonder
Probably
if
do.
like really like innovative original games are just games that are really good at presenting new choices and new ways to interact.
You know what
Um,
game is just really, really innovative in its choice mechanics?
I can tell whatever you're about to say is going to be bullshit. So what?
Tex Murphy and the
Tex
Martian
Murphy.
Manhunter.
Oh my god. Yeah. What do you do when you get presented by someone who responds in the same exact way every single time, incredulous that you're even speaking to them?
Well,
Murphy, what
uh,
are you doing? Or no, who's the French guy? What the hell are you doing? Every friggin' time you start a conversation with him. All of them.
uh,
No matter like
uh,
what like time has passed and we've like gone to different areas and oh my god.
doesn't matter. It's all.
Nope.
But yes, to actually end on a note that makes
Thoughtful
some
note.
sense with our show, uh, we have concluded that choices mechanically in games should be intuitive, and the way that you make choices should be subtle and intuitive
Yep.
simultaneously. So
QED. Stamp.
that's
Science of
that's
livership.
that's it. But next week we will not be talking about choices. This is the end of
Derp.
our two-part series. there's so much we could cover. We probably will cover in other episodes, but we'll just have a different focus.
Yep, hopefully.
In our discussions about choice, a lot of good games have come up. A lot of interesting dynamics have come up. So
Yeah.
we hope you enjoyed listening, and we will see you next week, provided there are no other mouth injuries.
Related injuries.
I realize that Greg uses his mouth a lot, so
Yeah.
there could be others. There could be others. Cool. All right. All right, we're signing out. Talk
Peace.
to you later. If you enjoyed this episode of Gaming Mechanics, check out our Twitter @GamingMechanics or our Facebook by going to facebook.com/gamingmechanics. Thanks for listening.